Welcome to everybody to this third Paul Priday Gender and Cultural Studies annual lecture. I'm Elspeth Probyn, Professor of Cultural Studies. I'm very sorry I can't be there in person, but I've got some personal issues that we're dealing with. First of all, I want to start with the acknowledgement of country. I'm speaking from the land of the Gadigal, and the university occupies the land of the Gadigal of the Eora Nation, and this site was for millennia the place of learning, law, ceremony, and celebration. I pay my respect to elders past, present, and emerging. I want to briefly thank the wonderful staff at the School of Humanities, Lauren, Julianne, and Peter for their help in organising this, and Turner as well. So a few words about the genesis of this lecture and about the late Paul Priday, Dr. Paul Priday. Paul used to always say that gender studies is rocket science, he drew out the fabulous intricacies of gender and culture, especially in his groundbreaking thesis on male creatives in multinational advertising firms. Paul and I was lucky enough to supervise him, and we worked together on several projects. He was so full of energy, enthusiasm, and ideas for the department. We, for instance, held training for staff at Aegis, and thanks to that, we have the funds to put on this lecture. I welcome his wife, Margot. Sadly, Polly, his daughter, has COVID and can't be there. Now, it's my great pleasure to introduce Professor Fran Martin from the Cultural Studies and Communication Studies at the University of Melbourne. Despite her youthful appearance, she is one of the pioneers of the study of sexuality, intimacy, gender, mobility, and media use amongst Chinese as well as Asian young people. This was and remains groundbreaking work. She's been fluent in Mandarin since studying the language in primary school, which just shows how far back we've gone, because that is precisely what is needed to be further promoted. Her 5-year ARC Future Fellowship was a longitudinal ethnographic project studying the social and subjective experiences of young women from China studying and living in Australia. She's the author or editor of 10 books, including numerous articles, and her latest book, from which parts of this talk are going to come, is called Dreams of Flight, The Lives of Chinese Women Students in the West. Her current ARC project examines media representations and or lived experiences of PR Chinese women who have graduated from Western universities, including Australian ones, and have returned home to China. This is, as you can see, immensely topical and important research, both academically and in the current geopolitical context. So Fran will speak for about 40-45 minutes, followed by Q&A chaired by my colleague, Associate Professor Guy Britton, before drinks and canapes. So please join me in welcoming warmly Fran Martin.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Elspeth. It's lovely to see you there on screen, if not in person. I would like to begin by reiterating that acknowledgement of the country of the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, where we meet today, and also to acknowledge the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, where I live and work in Naarm or Melbourne, and to extend respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging, and to acknowledge that these are unceded lands on which we're meeting and where I live and work. Thanks to Gender and Cultural Studies at the University of Sydney, and especially Professor Probin for the invitation to me to be here today. It's such a pleasure and a privilege to be speaking with you. And thanks to the staff from the School of Humanities as well for all the support today. And thanks to everyone here for coming. And particularly, it's an honour to be meeting some of Paul Priday's family members, and I'm so pleased to have that opportunity as well. So I am going to switch to, I need to screen share now at this, there we go, there it is. So what I'm speaking about today is the same study that Elspeth was mentioning to you just a moment ago, where between 2015 and about mid-2020 on the Future Fellowship Project, I was supported by the Australian Research Council to carry out this 5-year study of the experiences of a group of over 50 young women from the People's Republic of China who were studying in Australia. I'm just trying to get that to move on the slide. Oh no, there we go. And here are my methods. So I'll leave that. I'm not going to read through all of that technical stuff there, but I'll leave it there for you to see. And I'll speak a little bit about the experience of doing the project in just a moment. So as I'm sure we're all very aware, over the past 15 or so years, Chinese students have become a major presence at universities in Western nations, including in Australia. This reflects a few preconditions: the growth of China's urban middle classes, increasing academic competition and credential inflation in the Chinese education system, and in the case of the UK and Australia, national higher education systems that are in desperate need of these students' full fee incomes to fill the gap that is left by decreasing public funding per student. Less commonly discussed, though, is the gendered dimensions of China's educational diaspora. According to Chinese government statistics, just about 60% or so of outgoing students from China are female. And when we take into account the gender birth ratio skewing in favour of male babies being born in the years when these students were born, we see that Chinese women seem to be about 30% more likely to study abroad than Chinese men, approximately. So my study's motivations, as you can see here, are not only to explore why that might be the case, but also to help us understand how gender makes a difference overall in the overseas study experience. I've been especially interested in how studying abroad might affect young middle-class women and the way they're grappling with contradictory gendered self-understandings that are available to them in their home society. So one of my study's starting points was the observation of a tension in Chinese public culture of the reforms era, that is to say today, between a couple of different models of selfhood. On the one hand, the ideal of a self-reliant, self-entrepreneurial, professional self that speaks strongly to middle-class urban singleton daughters and is fairly familiar to us, I think, globally as a kind of general discourse of self-making in late capitalism, although it has specific kind of Chinese inflections. This is on the one hand. On the other hand, there's this other discourse, which is a neotraditionalist view of women's supposedly family-centric nature and their biological destiny to marry and have a child, or now to have more than one child, before they turn 30. This second view, has been increasingly supported by the state, by the government of China in the era of market reforms, which is a fairly big shift from the state feminism of the Mao era. So I wondered, how might several years spent studying in Australia affect young women's negotiation of this contradiction as they navigate their 20s, when they're trying to think what happens next in my life, what's most important to me, who am I as a woman, you know, how does all of this fit together? How do I negotiate the different things I'm supposed to be? So my study kind of followed the core participant group over 4.5 years, from pre-departure in China through several years of study in Melbourne, Canberra and Sydney, and on to postgraduate destinations across Australia, China and the world. And I've just got a few photos to give you a sense of what it was like doing that first leg of field work. These are pictures I took in China in 2015. So you can perhaps see on the two on the right, these are pre-departure sessions for students who are about to come to Australia. The one on the bottom run by IDP, a major kind of education player in the international education space, connected with the Australian government. And the top one there, it was a pre-departure for the University of Melbourne. Then there was the logo of or the kind of catchphrase of our university, Dream Large, one word. I think that was from a Guangzhou pre-departure. And the other one on that kiosk in the street that's taken in Shanghai, it's an ad for English qualifications, like English training, which you just see everywhere in the Chinese urban kind of spaces. And next, this slide is just some photographs from some of the group activities that I did with my participants. I met with them regularly and I conducted regular formal recorded interviews with each of them. This is a core group of 50, as well as spending countless hours hanging out more informally in groups and one-on-one, doing everyday activities together like shopping or cooking, or they'd invite me to their parties. Or what the blurred out image on the bottom left there is like a post-exams party that was held in Bandura near La Trobe University that they invited me to. So a group of students, and various other things that we did together in order to build a detailed picture of their lives, their experiences and their preoccupations. So the paper I'm presenting today draws on material that was gathered in the latter years of that project, especially in final interviews with participants after their studies, including those who'd gone back to China by then, as well as some who remained in Australia on temporary graduate work visas. And my aim is to explore the type of gendered identity that was produced through their experiences of international education. I should hasten to add that the study is in fact not finished, it's ongoing. I'm still going to be interviewing the 50 twice more on a new grant project over the next 3 years or 3 or 4 years. So this is a snapshot from the end of the first 5 years. I want to begin with two stories, which are, they're kind of long, but the reason I'm presenting them in their whole length is that a big part of the pleasure of this project for me was absorbing the detail of people's emotional and subjective kind of responses to their situation and to their experiences in Australia. So there's going to be a lot of summary in the second part of the paper on a kind of proto-sociological model, but these stories are much more rich and narrative. And I think that that does matter for the way that we understand people's experience. I've also selected these two because they're in some ways similar in ways that are useful for my argument and my findings, but in other ways they're contrasting, which is also interesting to me. So the first story is about Xiaofen. I'm calling her a pseudonym. She was the daughter of a university-educated entrepreneur and an administrative worker in a state enterprise. And she was 24 when I first met her, just a couple of weeks after she arrived in Australia. She had travelled to a prestigious university in Melbourne in order to undertake a 2-year master's degree in the accounting field. Following her bachelor's graduation from a top-ranked Chinese university, she had already worked for nearly 3 years in one of the Big Four accounting firms in her hometown, which is a wealthy, medium-sized city on China's east coast. Xiaofen had a steady boyfriend of 7 years, she told me in that first interview, and she expected that she would most likely bow to social pressure to get married and have a child before she turned 30. At our first meeting, Xiaofen told me that she felt she had been a bit headstrong or 任性 or capricious in deciding to study abroad at this point in her life. So I said, why? What do you mean? It seems like a sensible thing to me. But she said, well, the traditional view is that girls, when they get to this age, should settle down, work, get married, whatever. But I felt that if I didn't make this decision right now, I might never be able to do it. During Xiaofen's second year in Australia, she was already working towards a permanent residency or a PR application, and she hoped to gain some local professional experience after graduation. But Xiaofen's plans were interrupted by heartbreak. Out of the blue, her boyfriend broke off their relationship over remotely while she was in Melbourne, saying that his parents were pushing him to get married and implying heavily that it was she who had been unreasonable by leaving him in order to study abroad. Having picked a fight on the issue on the phone and forced a breakup, the ex-boyfriend then refused to have any communication at all with Xiaofeng, leaving her angry and confused. She redoubled her resolve to stay in Australia. But 8 months later, when I caught up with her at another time, Xiaofeng was still in emotional turmoil, all the more so after she saw her ex with a new girlfriend during a trip home. As she updated me on her situation in a cafe where we were chatting, her eyes filled with tears. She said, "I thought I was totally calm and over this, but it appears not." Xiaofeng was at the lowest point in her life so far. She began to regret her decision to study abroad, since it had cost her not only an enviable and well-paid job, but also her relationship with her first love. At her age, Xiaofeng worried that both of these would be difficult to replace. She was finding it hard to cope in Australia without close friends and family to support her, and had recently made a trip back to see her parents. And she said, "As soon as I stepped off that plane, everything from how my hometown smelled to how it looked and how it sounded, to the knowledge that my parents were there to look after me, it all just drew me back there. And I realized I need to spend some time there to recover before taking my next step." Xiaofeng went back to her hometown straight after graduation, after a demoralizing job search in which, as a childless woman of 27, she was passed over for many, many positions that were far more junior than the one she used to hold when she was 24. She finally found low-paid work at an internet company in Shanghai, relatively low-paid compared to her previous jobs before she got the master's. I met her there in Shanghai shortly after she began her new job. Now feeling stronger, Xiaofeng reflected that studying abroad had consolidated in her a mobile life outlook. She had obtained her Australian PR and imagined her own future and that of her hypothetical child, which she still assumed she will surely have, unfolding in a global context and involving ongoing potentials for transnational movement. She said, "I would definitely consider working in Australia, so at least the baby could have a choice of citizenship, right? Because I guess I'll probably have a child in the next 5 years. So later on, even if I don't go over myself, I'll be able to choose a citizenship status for the baby, right? All places are alike, including going abroad. I think it's just the same as going to another city. It's something I could do if I have the chance." When I met Xiaofeng again a year later in Shanghai, she returned to the same point and spoke a lot about the personal changes she'd observed in herself, thinking back to the first time she stepped off the plane from China to Australia. She couldn't understand the street signs. She didn't know how to find food. She was quaking inwardly and just feeling very sort of scared about this new experience. She compared that with her recent trip back to, just for tourism, to Queensland, where she did everything by herself. She booked the trip. She could obviously read the signs. She could navigate the trains. She wasn't even scared when she found herself alone in some dark country town late at night and missing the last train and so on. So she felt there'd been a huge boost to her self-confidence. And she said, "I feel that having completed the study abroad, I have more choices for the future. I feel my mind has been broadened. I feel I could work toward living overseas." She also reflected on having learned from observing what she called other people's tough or independent way of handling life problems. And she told me about specific women that she met on her travels who were doing things like traveling alone with 2 toddlers on a plane and just having to cope by themselves. She said, "In life, if you run into difficulties or find yourself in a bad situation, you'll certainly have more self-confidence and be able to resolve things more calmly. I really do think this is due to having studied abroad, because if I look at examples around me, like colleagues who've had 2 children or classmates who got married and babies pretty soon after graduating, what I mean is people around you are all living that way. If that's all you saw, you might not realize, oh, there's another way to live, a more tough way, that when you run into a problem, you can actually look within yourself to find strength and support." So that was story 1. Story 2 is in some ways, like I said, similar, in some ways different. 20-year-old Xiaoxing was the first among her family and friends to study abroad. She was the daughter of middle school educated small business owners in an industrial town in Guangdong, and she had traveled originally north to Henan in central China for university. There she enrolled in a joint program in international economics that linked that Chinese university with a university in Melbourne. Both of them were sort of mid-ranked institutions. Xiaoxing described her parents to me in our first interview in Guangzhou as feudal or fengjian, in that they did not permit her to have boyfriends while she was still studying, but she followed their rules. During her 2 years at university in Melbourne and subsequent one-year master's course in Sydney, Xiaoxing sought out every opportunity for volunteering and work-related training, consulting me about what to wear to professional appointments, where to buy that kind of clothes, and so on. She spoke with her parents regularly, several times a week, via video call. And on university holidays, she usually went back to help out in their small printing shop that they ran in the neighborhood market in her hometown. She hoped one day to earn enough money to let them stop working such a physically demanding job. Although Xiaoxing liked the idea of staying on in Australia to gain local professional experience, in fact, she went back home straight after graduation to complete formalities for her application to join the Communist Party of China, which I didn't know she was in the midst of that, but this is what unfolded. Xiaoxing had started her membership application during her first year of undergraduate studies in Henan. And before she could be admitted as a full member, she still had to be investigated by the party authorities at home for 6 months to a year. So she explained later that her father had encouraged her to join the party as a matter of family pride. She said for him, it might be sort of a spiritual comfort, kind of like our family had no one before me who'd been to university. I'm pretty much the first one in our family. My dad looks at it sort of like that. He feels that it'd be something like an honor for me to join the Communist Party of China. When I interviewed her again a couple of months after her return home, Xiaoxing gave the following account of her job search. As soon as I got home, my parents started suggesting pretty strongly that I stay in my hometown to work. So her hometown is kind of like a smallish town, very close to Guangzhou, but it's not Guangzhou. It's a town, like a smaller place. A couple of weeks after I got back, I got an invitation for a job interview. The company was in a district of Shenzhen, pretty far away from the central city area. When my dad found out, he wouldn't agree to let me go. But the way I saw it, if you go to an interview, it doesn't mean they're going to hire you. I just wanted to increase my interview experience to help me in the future. But he wouldn't even let me go there. I had to say, okay, I guess I'll give up that opportunity. After that, my parents had a talk with me. They asked me not to put myself under pressure to find work immediately. And then they raised another point, which was that they don't really want me to go out even to Guangzhou to work. This is like, I don't know, about just within 50 kilometers, like it's quite close. But actually, I myself, I have this wish. I do want to go out and experience the outside world to grow up a bit. So right now, I guess I should work on discussing this further with them. I've mentioned it to you before, their thinking is fairly traditional. But if my parents don't agree, I can't just insist on going away to work. The place where I live, if I want to find work in the finance field, opportunities will be very, very few. There are probably no positions of this type around this area. Lately, opportunities are all in Guangzhou or in certain other areas because my hometown is more about manufacturing and logistics. It doesn't fit with my professional direction. So I really need to go to Guangzhou or Shenzhen or another city. Right now, near our home, just in a residential neighbourhood, there's a public institution seeking staff. That is a sort of neighbourhood state institution. My parents want me to take the civil service exam, but I haven't registered to do it because I feel like asking me to suddenly change my professional direction like that is really a bit much. So right now I'm preparing for the entry test for this job near home to give it a try. And I'm also still having a go at finding work according to my own career plan in the finance field. If I can find it, my first preference would be a job in a foreign enterprise. Xiaoxing pointed out some of the ways she felt study abroad had changed her. Before, at my old university in China, my life was more traditional, really like 3 points, one line, shuttling between dormitory, classroom, and canteen. Going out to abroad, you have to do everything yourself. and you need to understand how to manage some of your own time. You might even need to find a part-time job. You have to organize everything yourself and plan it all. So I feel I've had this kind of experience a bit earlier than others, and it's changed my attitude. If I'd stayed home, I might find going out to seek a part-time job a bit scary or embarrassing. That's how I used to feel. But since I went out, it just feels like a very natural thing. But when I next heard from her a few months later, Xiaoxing had taken the job that her parents preferred, close to home, unrelated to her university studies, in the local government organisation. In a WeChat message, she described her work in what I recognise as very kind of statified socialist party language, very official. She said, "I've learned lots of new knowledge, especially work connected with party affairs. It's been very good lately. I've had more responsibilities in work connected with building the party, so life has been very fulfilling. My work responsibilities are connected with themed activities organised by the work unit to serve the masses of the people and the industrial park enterprises, like a free clinic to promote workplace health, a flower arranging activity to express care for women, and so on. It's increased my abilities in event management and my capacity to communicate proactively with others, and brought me closer to the masses of the people and to corporate representatives, which assists with advancing my daily work." So that's the end of the narrative part. I want now to think about what the sort of comparing and contrasting these two stories might suggest. Xiaofen and Xiaoxing are two young women returning with Australian master's degrees and both intending to seek work in China's financial sector. They tell stories that mirror each other in some ways, but diverge quite importantly in other ways. Both express desires for ongoing geographic mobility. Xiaofen at the transnational level as a form of selective citizenship of Australia and China at the same time. Xiaoxing at the domestic level as intercity professional mobility. The two women's potentials to realise these desires, however, are distinguished basically by class difference. With her comfortable family background, prestigious Chinese and Australian degrees, high-level professional work experience and Australian PR, Xiaofen is quite conscious of her own mobility potential and understands it through the language of multiplied choices. It gives her a way of experiencing the world such that, with the exception of the emotional resonance of her hometown, all places are alike, everywhere, you could be anywhere. Xiaoxing is also aware of the potential for mobility that her skills and qualifications give her. They could be a ticket to a professional career in a large city, possibly even a job in a foreign firm, a far cry from the geographic and social restriction of her undergraduate days. But in the face of parental opposition to living away from home, she struggles to realise that potential. Xiaoxing's corralling into the state sector in the neighbourhood government organisation shows an interesting alignment between neo-traditionalist gender regulation and the socialist state apparatus that other scholars have also noted. It also brings into focus a gender geography of feminine spatial constriction that is activated through Xiaoxing's parents' class-bound traditionalism. Both women return from study abroad ambitious to advance their professional careers, and both emphasise a discourse of self-reliance that is prominent in China's post-socialist public culture. And they both feel that living abroad helped them kind of go more in that direction. They both voice an individualised self-view, understanding values of self-confidence, toughness, and self-management as key and important. But Xiaofen's sense of individualised identity is stronger than Xiaoxing's, which is connected again with the class-specific ways in which gender shapes each woman's opportunities. So there's a number of other kind of contrasts I could speak about. But despite these numerous points of contrast, Xiaofen's and Xiaoxing's stories of returning to China and reflections on how their journeys had changed them also share some key elements in common, which were reflected in the narratives of many, many other participants too. Their further reflections in interviews reinforce the sense that study abroad produces a distinct form of graduate identity, which is, that's a belated picture of, I think 24 or 5 of the participants on a big excursion we did before we got on the bus. Okay, so here we are. And a number of kind of key points that the graduates seem to share in common. characterized by desires for mobility, which I've just been discussing, individualization, ambition, reflexivity, consumerism, professional orientation, employer identification, and gender detraditionalization. So I want to elaborate very briefly on these latter points with some other quotes, which I may not read out, so I'll just kind of have them on the screen there. So the first one is individualization. As the stories I've just told you indicate, a central theme running through graduate participants' responses to the question of how they felt study abroad changed them was the sense that the experience strengthened their self-focus. They dwelled on the value of living life in your own way, living out my own self, as you see here, living for yourself, living more self-centeredly, living to become yourself. There were endless kind of phrases with this kind of idea at the center of it, instead of deferring to or relying on other people. This equates to the convictions that one's own desires, happiness, and interests ought to constitute the core concerns of one's life, and that one should make oneself more self-reliant, more independent, and more autonomous. Returnees, it was felt, tended to care more about what they themselves care about and pay less attention to other things, as Shang said. They have more of their own ideas, as Yining said, and could make any kind of decision and completely and utterly shoulder the consequences, as Feng said. And they also felt one should live life for one's own sake and not for the sake of others. That one's from Shu Yuan. This is a form of ideological individualization, the desire to live for oneself rather than for others, that sociologists connect with the post-industrial kind of culture of modernity, or the culture of post-industrial modernity, I guess worldwide. Participants did feel it was the experience of living abroad without family support, though, that fostered this temperamental independence and self-focus. The change began, interestingly, it's not so much about absorbing some sort of Western value system. I feel what I observed was it was more from the practical level of everyday life that this began. For example, learning practical life skills and extending then into a more fundamental reorientation of one's values and priorities. The new, more individualized identity was expressed then in everyday activities undertaken solo. For example, sisters Mingwen and Mingyu discussed how 3 years living in Melbourne and Canberra, away from their family and collective dorm life on campus in China, made them much more comfortable eating, window shopping, and going to class alone. Mingyu linked this capacity specifically with her imagined future professional role, where she imagined that things like this will seem really normal now. So this is about a business trip she took, an internship where they went from Shanghai to Beijing on the high-speed rail, but they did not sit together with her colleagues. She said then, before in China, that would have seemed a bit weird. Not like you're going together, why are you sitting separately in different carriages? But now I feel it's pretty good. You feel like you have some personal space. We're on the same train, but we didn't see each other until we got out at Beijing. Things like that seem really normal now. So it's a capacity she feels she's got from living abroad, and now she's using it in professional work in the finance field here. Things like this may seem like trivial examples, but I'd actually argue that it's in fact indicative of a significantly changed way of life and self-view, a more individualized sense of self reflected in everyday activities. Next, ambition. The type of identity that participants felt was fostered by study abroad was not only individualized, but also ambitious, proactive, and self-confident in its pursuit of goals. The ideal graduate subject, participants thought, strives to advance by her own efforts and grasps every opportunity proactively. All of the graduate participants felt a level of compulsion to embody such a drive, even those who were kind of unsure whether they really wanted to or whether they really liked that in some way. They still kind of felt like they should be like that. This attitude was summarized neatly by Shang when I spoke with her several months after her return to China, when she was working far from home for very little money in a media startup in Shanghai. You can see her quote here on the screen, the key parts highlighted in pink. So she's essentially saying she feels those who've studied overseas are more self-confident. They know what they want. I feel I've become proactive. If you're not proactive, you might not get a chance, right? So she sent out her CV everywhere. She went around saying, you know, do you want to give me a job? Contacting HR departments. I mean, I made myself more and more into a proactive person. Through this self-training overseas, I've been able to make myself more independent. I proactively developed myself. I feel that all those who went abroad and came back, all of them, most of them, have certain hopes for their future. They hope to do something, right? It's this kind of ambitious orientation. Next, reflexivity. Shang's emphasis on self-knowledge, right? The importance of knowing what one wants, also points towards another central feature of self-perceived graduate identity. It's reflexivity. The graduate subject is a subject who knows herself. She looks out on broad horizons, conscious of the relativity of cultures and systems. She's inspired to reflect on the limits of the local and feels herself to be at home in diversity. Along these lines, Yining reflected during a return visit to Melbourne a year after a year of working in China. She said this: so I expect more of myself in terms of tolerance, right? She's got a wider worldview. And then she disparagingly talks about those who wouldn't have this. They'd have a narrow worldview. They can only see this little circle that they already know. But if you have been abroad and you have a higher level of tolerance, you think more things are acceptable. Everyone has their own way of living and you shouldn't judge other people. So a general kind of mind broadening. The idea that one became more tolerant due to studying abroad was repeated by many, many other participants too. The idea was that knowledge of the plurality of cultural systems tended to relativize one's own understanding of oneself and one's beliefs and values. So educational mobility was understood to foster a new level of reflexivity by broadening the graduate's field of vision beyond the little circle of local life that previously constituted her world. Some graduates also described a change in their attitude toward consumption as a result of having studied abroad. In Australia, the students often, not always, often though, lived amid the affluent consumer culture in the downtown districts of Australia's large cities, devoting their leisure time to coffees and brunches in trendy cafes and tourist trips to picturesque country attractions, all of which they photographed and uploaded to their WeChat and Instagram feeds. Most were also in daily contact with friends, classmates, or flatmates engaged in e-trading, right, or a daigou, or it's sometimes called personal shopping, in which the act of consumption itself of clothes, of health products, of clothing, of jewelry, cosmetics, and luxury goods is monetized for the reseller's profit, again with images of the commodities circulated endlessly through social media. And I'm sure you have seen the daigou shops that use, well, probably not so much now, before COVID, were everywhere around the University of Sydney, where you can buy Australian skin cream and, you know, milk formula and sheepskin and stuff and sell it on to people in China at a small profit. So in this context, Chi-Chi, whose best friend was an absolute star at doing e-trading, she's constantly surrounded by images of these goods. Chi-Chi said, "You get a certain understanding of luxury goods and name brands. Before I went overseas, I didn't really know about these. When I was in China before, I thought they were too luxurious to buy." So she's talking about stuff like maybe Pandora jewelry or something that her flatmate used to sell, and some of the more expensive makeup brands. So now that I'm back from abroad, I think nothing of it. You're not so wary of this type of high-end consumption. And we see a similar, this is a longer story from Shu Yuan, but she gives us more detail on her upbringing with the thrifty view of consumption from her, which she thinks passed down from her grandma and grandpa, who, you know, having lived through that mid-century period in China, had lived in very poor conditions for many years, which then improved, but their consumption habits sort of stayed the same. And her mum picked up those consumption habits also, probably during the 1970s and 80s when her mum would have been young. So when I first went overseas, I was that way too. But later, maybe because Chinese students in Australia are fairly wealthy, she said, living in that environment, I integrated with them and started to buy luxury goods. I started to feel like once you've earned that money, if you have nowhere to spend it, then it's no use whatsoever in my life. So then I started spending a bit more money to buy a few things that weren't very useful, but that did make me happy. So, I mean, it's an interesting quote. Again, you know, the thing with these quotes, they're so everyday, they can sound ordinary, but if we sort of scratch the surface there, this is illustrating an interesting link between discretionary consumption and the broader graduate valuation of self-focus and individual happiness. So it's not just about having the money to spend, it's also about a subjective reorientation, I think. Professional orientation is the next one. Many participants explicitly linked the characteristics of their new graduate identity to the requirements of the professional workplace. So in this context, we can think about something that Feng said. She was a graduate returnee, originally from Yunnan province in the southwest, far southwest. And she was now working far from home in Shanghai. And she said this: if I hadn't studied abroad, my life goals would not be so lofty. You wouldn't look at your career as a very important part of your life, right? It might be about the same level of importance as your marriage. You might be more inclined to go along with traditional thinking. But study abroad has helped, again, broaden my horizon so you can see different issues and perspectives that could influence your own future professional development. So she links that subjective reorientation with professional development. So I think previously my worldview wasn't so broad and I didn't think so much about issues. My personality wasn't so independent. So the limitations in terms of future work were fairly obvious. So the point I'm laboring here is these changes are not interesting simply because maybe they're general values that, you know, students or graduates would see as valuable, but because in a sense they become instrumentalized as something that's going to be helpful for a certain kind of career making, which is very understandable. After graduation, all of the participants in this study hoped to work professionally for at least a few years, and most of them said they prioritized professional development over marriage and childbearing. I guess that's partly connected with the big investment of time and money in the overseas education. So you sort of don't want to waste that by suddenly getting married and having 2 or 3 babies, understandably. But it does also articulate very clearly and logically with the graduates' tendency to be increasingly critical of the neo-traditionalist family-centric model of adult women's social role, which I'll speak about more in a moment. But first, a particularly interesting one, I think, is what I've called here, somewhat simplistically, employer identification. So this is about sympathy for the employer's position despite one's own exploitation and exclusion. I noticed this in participants' responses to experiencing discrimination when seeking professional work. For those who sought professional work in Australia, the discrimination they faced was based on their race, nationality, and visa status. For those who sought work in China, it was based on age and gender. So those participants who remained in Australia after graduation hoped to take up the professional opportunities promised by Australia's temporary graduate visa, which allows foreign graduates of Australian universities to work for a period of time post-study. Despite this visa existing and them having it, participants seeking work found that many Australian employers point blank refused to accept job applicants or even interns on that visa. But while on the one hand, graduates were indeed frustrated to find themselves locked out of desirable professional opportunities, and I just as a snarky footnote, I should say, it's the offer of this visa that was one of the draw cards that made them choose Australia in the first place. And then they came and couldn't find the work. But despite that, some of them voiced justifications of the employer's preferences, saying it was understandable that bosses required local experience or were reluctant to hire graduates on temporary visas, since they would then risk training them up and losing their investment if they left the country. This echoes an opinion that was voiced by some participants who worked in unskilled and underpaid hospitality jobs while they were studying, so before graduation. They also sometimes said they could understand that it might be difficult for their employers to offer them, say, a legal minimum wage or any employee entitlements at all. They could understand the position of the boss. This mixed attitude, which aligns simultaneously with the perspective of employee and employer, recurred among graduates who returned to China. For some master's students, overseas study was originally intended to counter gender bias in China's domestic job market. But returning with Australian master's degrees in hand, and this is supposed to make them more competitive, many of them, like Xiaofeng, whose story I told earlier, found that employers' gender bias still obstructed their path. And often it was even exacerbated because overseas study had obviously made them, well, not made them, but during overseas study, they had become a few years older. So they were considered to be a risk of immediately getting married and wanting maternity leave. But while many criticised this bias, some also expressed a degree of sympathy for discriminatory employers. And here's a very, very long quote. But essentially we have here the sisters, Mingwen and Mingyu, talking about looking for work. And they talk at length about the gender discrimination that they both faced, because their dad has a lot of connections, and this means that he was, you know, recommending them for positions in their field of study, in the finance field. And then when they were getting rejected, they were getting the real reason why, because the contact would tell their dad what happened. And it was essentially, you know, they want to hire boys and not girls into these positions. So it was very frustrating. After multiple times, this kept happening. But then they go on to say there in the last bit, we actually, if you think about it, it makes sense. So another example, I had an interview. They asked me, do you have a boyfriend or whatever? They're worried you'll get married as soon as you start work, then have a baby and they'll have to support you. You haven't even learned anything and he has to support you. The cost is too high. And her sister says, if you stand in the shoes of the employer, you can actually understand their position, right? So it's this kind of dual positioning. And this was echoed by many, many other participants. For example, Ci Hui observed she was criticized, she was in the middle of a spiel criticizing employers' tendency to question job applicants about their plans for having children because it was affecting her as well. But then she went on to say, but if you start there and straight away have a baby, the company isn't a charity after all. Why would I want to bring in someone like that and act like a charity, right? When I think about it, I can understand it. So again, what stands out here is the split and shifting self-positioning of the speakers, alternating between resentment of their own gendered disadvantage and sympathy for the employers who exclude them. Rather than being inspired to solidarity with other disadvantaged workers or further structural analysis, say, of the gendered costs of reproduction in a market society, instead of doing that, they tended to view the issue from two contradictory perspectives simultaneously. And I think the attitudinal alignment across those who were before graduating, after graduating in China, in Australia, it was a kind of general tendency then in the group to identify against their own immediate interests as employees with the point of view of an individual business owner or manager, viewing her workforce in terms of cost-benefit analysis and profit maximization. So they tended to kind of put up with inequity in the present with the idea that they kind of clinging to the dream that someday they can climb up and be the one at the top and then things will be better. So taken together, the points I have just discussed suggest that the graduates developed an understanding of themselves as mobile, enterprising individuals, which would fit them well for middle-class urban life and professional private sector labour. Overseas studies seem to strengthen their identification with exactly the type of desiring, consuming, self-animating, self-staging subject that is so ideologically central to contemporary China's globally linked market economy and society. The understanding of oneself as a mobile, self-motivating, self-managing, reflexive individual, identified with the perspectives of employers and management, and somewhat disembedded from ties to locality and family, aligns graduate identity with many of the demands of a neoliberalized professional workforce, both in China's large economically developed cities and globally. So I'm coming to the last section now. I hope I'm all right for time. Yeah, just a couple more minutes. Because this is sort of like an interesting section that I can't possibly leave out, so I'm not going to. Because things get a little bit more interesting when we take gender into account. I mean, I've been talking about it all the way through, but now let's focus. A central feature of the graduates' view of themselves as mobile enterprising individuals is precisely their increasing kind of skepticism about the neotraditionalist model of women's identity that is supported by the Chinese state and public culture. For some women, overseas study was the beginning part of a strategy to distance themselves from social pressures within China to stick to a standard feminine life course. Several years later, that suspicion of the standard life script for women had consistently intensified, like right across the 50 participants. I'm just going to show you two very quick selected examples from many, many similar statements made during the post-graduation interviews. So here we see Fran Martin talking about how she has come to doubt what her dad says. Her dad had a series of classical set sayings, which she used to think were terrific. But now she doesn't really agree with the first one, which is at each life stage or stage in life, people should do the things appropriate to that stage. When you should study, you should study. When you should marry, you should marry. When it's time to have children, you must have children. You should do what you have to do. One's life should proceed by set stages. After coming here, I realized this can't apply to all people. I don't think Fran Martin really meant it didn't apply to her, because she still was fairly planning, she was planning to marry her boyfriend and have children and things, but she was starting to get loosened from this script, from her identification with that. And here's another one. This one is, I don't have her name attribution on there, but it's an interesting one. It's Chin. She was an interesting interviewee and participant. So she said, like others, studying abroad made me care about myself a little bit more. Everything's fine. She had a boyfriend, quite a wealthy family. Everything was lovely in her world, but I just don't want to get married. I want to wait until I've realized my self-value through work. When you go overseas, you rely on yourself for everything. So now when you come back, you still want to rely on yourself. My mum and dad have been really supportive, but they do hope I'll get married soon, though I take no notice of them. Oh, it's just so free living alone. Because I got used to it while I was in Australia. So she means living alone, not with parents, not with boyfriend, just in her lovely apartment in Shanghai. So when considering why studying abroad should change one's attitude toward the gendered life course in this way, some of them did link it with a vague sense that Western women were freer from pressures to marry and have children on a fixed schedule. But others connected the change more simply, as I mentioned before, in another context, with the experience of independent living. As Ming Yu put it, it might not be because of seeing the lives of the locals, but just about being alone by yourself. You tend to feel it's fine to be without a boyfriend. Life goes along pretty smoothly. You can go out with friends, you have more freedom. All this might be another reason why we change in this kind of way. So now the actual conclusion. A value-laden understanding of overseas graduate women's identity thus emerged from participants' reflections. In their experience, women like themselves who had studied abroad seemed likely to be unmarried, independent, focused on professional career, following a flexible life course, and geographically mobile. They aspired towards individualized identity expressed through everyday practices, routine activities undertaken alone, and lives lived separately from family. They valued professional ambition, cultural reflexivity, and consumption for personal pleasure. These features associated overseas graduates in their own minds with the positive values of freedom and modernity. And they frequently contrasted that negatively with friends and peers, cousins, whatever, who had stayed in China, who were then more traditional, more likely to be married, more likely to rely on others, focused on family, still stuck in the traditional, neo-traditional vision of kind of feminine life stages, and more fixed in place as well, linking them with the negative values of constraint and tradition. So therefore we can, I guess, see here that while on the one hand, overseas study appears to strengthen women's identification with the global ideal of a mobile enterprising individual, on the other hand, it seems correspondingly to weaken their attachment to the neo-traditionalist model of femininity that's promoted by the Chinese state. So it's, I guess, my ultimate very meta level conclusion is it seems to disembed them to some degree from national systems of gender ideology or regulation and re-embed them into more transnational systems of what I'm calling for shorthand neoliberal ideology. Now, of course, this is a greatly simplified account that cannot do justice to the complexity and multiplicity of participants' experiences during transnational education. However, what did remain constant across the vast majority of accounts are participants' decreasing desire for neo-traditionalist femininity and their increasing attachment to the ideal of ongoing personal mobility, whether that's within China or transnationally. For all of them, settlement in place was associated negatively with re-traditionalized femininity, while mobility was linked positively with an alternative, more individualized form of gendered selfhood and that to which they aspired. They understood themselves as a new generation and a new kind of women, women whose multiplied choices and potentials for mobility, their capacity for dreams of flight, were at the very core of what it means to live. Thanks. That's the end.
Thank you so much, Fran. That was a really stunning talk, and far from being simplistic, it raises the really deeply poignant, it raises a deeply poignant twist that these women find themselves in, which I would imagine is only worse with the economic downturn. So, I mean, I'm so glad that you're continuing on this study, because it is revolutionary in a way of what's happening, and we don't know where that revolution is going. Anyway, my great thanks to Fran, and now Guy will take over chairing.
Thank you, Professor Martin, for a really interesting presentation, a lecture, and an amazing project that you have done. I applaud your dedication to be at the field site for the past 5 years and another 3 years with the same group of 50 participants. So that brought me to this question, and I'm actually interested to hear about your reflection notes as a researcher spending so much time with this group of 50 participants. I can only imagine the emotion work that you have to put in, not just doing all the interviews with them, but also shopping with them. And I can't do what you do. It's just, I mean, it sounds exhausting. So I just want to know the kind of emotion work that you have to undertake for the past 5 years with this group of participants. How has that relationship changed? And how do you then try not to let the personal friendships get into the way of your analysis? And I'm also interested to know how has your own gender identity expressions and orientation shifted from doing this study? And lastly, I mean, if there's no time, don't answer this. I'm just also interested to know about your respondents. I mean, it sounds quite positive that they become more confident, they become more self-assertive and more career-oriented and blah, blah, blah. But I wonder if you have come across any stories that show that studying abroad has brought significant damage to their lives, to their self-esteem, because of all the horrible things that happen when you're studying abroad. Thanks.
Oh yeah. Thank you, Eileen. Great questions. I'll try and think of all of the 3 parts of your question. Yeah, the emotional work of doing the study was quite huge. But I mean, I'm so grateful to the Australian Research Council for giving me 5 years of time to dedicate myself to it, right? If I didn't have that full time, I mean, it was amazing. Like, who gets that opportunity? It's such a great scheme. I'm so grateful for that. So that was what allowed me to have the time to do it. And I still felt very busy. Like, you kind of think, well, I'm not teaching, I'm not doing any admin. All I have to do is hang out with these young women. But it was massive, like a lot of stuff. They almost became, some of them kind of, they didn't quite become part of my family, but I hung out with them, with my family, like my partner and kid. And things happened in their lives, which were really sad. Somebody's father passed away in the middle of the study. All kinds of things happened for them. Some of them came out, their sexuality. Yeah, so there was a lot of emotional labor. Somebody else had a mental breakdown and was forcibly admitted to a psychiatric hospital, which I was kind of her only contact locally during that time. That was extremely difficult. Yeah, but I mean, I was resourced to do this, so it was okay. And I had the time, I had the energy, and I had the commitment to it. So I just felt really privileged to be able to do that. And I felt really grateful that they allowed me to hang out with them, which kind of gets to your second point about how reflecting on my own gendered sense of self. Yeah, I mean, at first I didn't really know how to describe myself to them. I'm like, am I going to be the creepy auntie? Like, who is this white lady who's kind of wanting to look at our lives and say, can I come to your apartment and invite me to your parties? And, you know, it kind of freaked me out. I sort of didn't know how to be, but they pretty much took me as a mentor, like an academic mentor. And I think that that's why, I mean, initially they didn't know me from a bar of soap. So why participate in the study? It was the idea that, well, this person is working in an Australian university. I'm about to go to Australia, maybe to that very university where she works. And if I know this person, maybe that's going to be useful. And I did try to give back to them, not only in gift cards and the thing, you know, participant incentives, but and not only in the trips that I organised, like tourism and stuff for them as well in Victoria, but also with advice. Like I was happy to talk to them about what they should wear to an interview or whatever. So I was trying to reciprocate their generosity somehow. And yeah, I mean, I guess there is a danger, the third part of your question, I guess there is a danger of, in this kind of very high level summary, of it's all seeming very positive. I mean, but the thing to keep in mind is I'm talking about the narratives they told me in this paper. This is what they said had happened, which is a positive thing. I mean, I guess when you've invested money and time and emotion in all these years of study abroad, and then the researcher says, so how have you changed? You're probably going to want to feel positive. I'm not saying it's not true, but like this is a narrative of we are more like this now. It doesn't mean that that's literally the only thing that happened, and it certainly isn't. I mean, I think Xiaofen's story of the heartbreak of coming back to the same field in a lower level after her study abroad shows some of the kind of things that can go wrong and the way that people might come to regret the decision. There was another two participants, there were only two, who didn't graduate, and they were, well, one was the one who had the mental breakdown, and the other one just didn't pass her master's degree. And that was obvious. I mean, she didn't put it in so many words, but I could see at the time that she just was very down. It was a very difficult time. Also, participants were subject to racist attacks, or they heard about friends who had been subject to racist attacks and then felt like very not at home and very fearful. There was a big kind of wave of fear about urban space in about 2016 in Melbourne, and then also in Canberra later, where some of them then happened to be when that those students were attacked at the bus stop. So there was a lot of negative experiences there that were very, very not good. So yeah, I mean, again, looking at the detail rather than the summary, you get a much more ambivalent picture. But what we see here is the ideal, right? This is what you hope and kind of feel study abroad has done for you. It doesn't, but it's not the whole story, absolutely. So thanks for the questions.
Thank you so much for sharing all of the outcomes of your study so far. One of the questions I had is, as a Chinese Australian woman growing up here and having done study abroad as well, and also then wanting to move overseas at some point as well, some of what their experiences resonate with me as well. And a lot of what they say they grew in, kind of their attitudes, etc., was a part of their studying overseas experience in the same way that I felt was mine. How do you delineate between what is just a general study abroad experience and the positive outcomes of that versus, you know, the positive outcomes of studying abroad as a Chinese woman in the West?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I agree with you. I also think that some of this is probably about being between the ages of 18 and 30. Like it just, stuff changes. Of course, there's a real risk in China studies of China exceptionalism. Like I'm kind of thinking, no, the Chinese case is unique. It is kind of course, as any context is unique, but it's also going to be somewhat, it'll have features in common with other such experiences. As to where to draw that line, we'd have to do a comparative study, right? And that would be a good project to see in general, or in another case, you know, someone like yourself or someone who went to, you know, Germany or whatever, would similar things happen for them? We could do that. We could sort of pick up other studies in the field. I mean, and there are groups of scholars generally looking at youth mobilities and trying to think about this on a broader level. I think particularly of Shanti Robertson's work on young people moving not only for study, but also working holiday makers and young migrants between Asia and Australia. And some of her findings really resonate with this as well, which suggests exactly as you say that it could be more general in some ways. I think that what's specific, it's the context that they come from. So the ways in which, the thing that I'm with some trepidation calling like a global neoliberal style discourse of selfhood. See, I kind of cringe when I say that because it's so generalizing. What I'm calling that, it's the China version of that is so specific. And I guess that's in the detail of, of the text and stuff that I've tried to bring that out. But then we can also generalize other aspects of it. Yeah. Okay.
Thank you for sharing your work. It was really interesting to listen to it. Sorry if this is a bit of a naive question, but how did you come to this topic in the first place 5 years ago, and what inspired you to start researching it? And my other question was, did you see many differences? Oh, sorry. The question was, you talked about the two stories and you said that one of the students, a lot of them had changed understandings of gender and their own identity and personhood and whatnot.
Yeah.
But then their actions kind of show differently, like that woman who went and did the Communist Party and she worked for the state and she had a total change of career. Why do you think that happened?
Yeah, great questions. Thank you. In terms of how I came to this study, I kind of had this, as a sort of this mid-career researcher at the time, after, working as an academic and a researcher for a decade or two, I felt I had been doing all of this stuff on China and Taiwan and Hong Kong and stuff that wasn't in Australia. And it started to feel a bit strange because after all, we're teaching all of these students from China. So I felt like it was almost like ethically, I felt like I needed to think about that connection between where I work and the kind of, academic training I've had in Chinese studies. And it seemed that students were a really way of doing that because after all, we're working with these students, like let's understand them a bit more. There's also an ethical point there. Also, I was myself, I went overseas to study in China when I was really young as well. It went between the ages of 17 and 19, I was there. So, and I know how that felt. That felt really life-changing. So I just kind of thought, well, what if we turn it around and I now look at these women who've gone in the other direction? So those are the two most clear motivations. The second part, why? So, and I should preface this by saying that question that you've asked in the second one is actually what I really want to look at in the next phase of the study. Like we've heard what the graduates say they think they've become, but what happens in the next 5 years, right? Like how are they able to realize that? I believe that they want to realize that. I don't think it's some random change of mind, but we saw in the case of Xiaoxing, like why couldn't she realize her dream of working for a foreign company in China? Because her parents wouldn't let her move away from her hometown. Why wouldn't they let her move away from her hometown? Because in my interpretation, she's always said they're traditional. I can see from their professions and their level of education that they're sort of lower to middle class. They're not upper middle class like Xiaoxing's parents. So they don't have a world in which it's okay for a daughter to go away and realize that ambition. So that was, in that case, it was connected with class. In every case, it would be connected with various things, right? It would be case specific. But we'll see in the next phase of the study what external circumstances like that, how they shape those desires that the graduates come out with.
Yep, I'll come to you in a moment. We just have a couple of questions from Zoom. I'll do my best to read them out. First one is from Jin Chi. In your research, how did you position yourself as an insider and an outsider?
I can't. I mean, the only sense in which I'm an insider is that I work in the Australian higher education sector. I'm an insider to that. I'm not an insider in any other way with this group other than being a woman, I guess. So I think, I mean, I've enjoyed throughout the various research projects I've done in China, Taiwan, Hong Kong and other places, the status of outsider, which is fantastic for ethnography and interviews. You know, there's a kind of an outsider advantage often in that people will explain things to you in huge detail. because they assume you don't understand anything about the situation, which is a very rich way of answering a question, you know, as opposed to just assuming, well, you're kind of an insider, so you would know. So that positioning was useful to me. I'd say broadly, I was positioned as an outsider, if that was your question, rather than much of an insider, except in relation to the Australian higher education system, in which case I had knowledge that was valuable to them and that I could share with them when they wanted that kind of knowledge. I hope that answers the question.
Zoom before the audience. It's quite a long one, so I might try. It's a question from Xiao Jun, and the new situation in COVID-19 and what experiences of mobility of your study, and sort of a lot of reports of increasing violence, domestic violence, and the launch of the third child policy and public discourses that urge the extension of maternal leave, kind of a bunch of factors around.
Yeah, no, those are great questions. My formal fieldwork period ended right when COVID happened. So my observations of what happened to my participants after that were just informal. But clearly their mobility was affected. I mean, the massive lockdowns, I think we know that the big toll that they have taken on people, particularly in the larger cities that were affected most harshly by those lockdowns. And the rest of the question, it's really a matter for the follow-ups of the study, I think. The question of how do the three-child policy and the various debates around that, how's that going to impact women who are now nearly 30, many of them. I mean, when the two-child and the three-child policies came out, participants who talked to me about it were universally horrified by the change in policy, in the sense that, my God, it's hard on a number of levels. On the one hand, it's hard enough to have one child. It's so expensive in a city like Shanghai, where a lot of them lived or were from. How do you even have one? How are you going to afford the school, the training, the kinder, everything you have to do, let alone the interruption to your own career? And now they want us to have 2 and 3, you know. It's just, some of them were quite angry about that assumption that it was fine for them to sacrifice their own careers in order to kind of fix the population crisis. So definite hesitation before signing up for more than one child, but we'll see. I mean, at least one participant has now had or two have had children since since the end of the study. So those kids will be kind of babies and toddlers by now, and I'll just need to see to answer that question properly, what happens next.
We actually do have quite a few questions online, but unfortunately we're running out of time. So I'll just take one more from the audience. I think. Someone? We'll have to.
Thank you, Fran, for inspirational speech. I actually have 2 questions. One is actually coming from myself as well, because a few days ago, my dad just reminded me, and he has always been reminding me that my own independence depends on his purse strings. So I assume that a lot of your participants are funded by their parents.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if that parental financial support was referenced when they're talking about their independence in that sense. And I think my second question, sorry, I'm a bit nervous, so I wrote it down. And then I was wondering if that all those transformations in their thoughts and ideologies, is that temporarily, or is it actually a long-lasting thing? Because in my own research, when I tried to interview participants before and after they going back to China, and they were sort of reported and saying that yes, the things that they do here, they don't necessarily carry out in China anymore because everyone else is doing it differently. Right. I don't want to do it differently as well. Yeah. So I was just wondering if that's also common in your data.
Yeah, fantastic. Thank you. So the first question on the fact that they're actually not independent at the time when they're saying they are. Yeah, no, that, I mean, of course, participants reference that often in a discourse of gratitude to the parents for enabling them to take this journey. When they spoke about becoming more independent, they didn't mean financially yet. It was like temperamentally independent, aspiring towards financial independence. Quite a lot of their mothers had already encouraged them to be financially independent and to not rely on a husband because of the high divorce rate and so on. It's seen as risky, as I'm sure you know. So the independence thing is more aspirational in financial terms than actual in the present, and they certainly wouldn't downplay their gratitude to their parents. Often they expressed a desire to maybe, if they got PR, to bring their parents out here to look after them in their old age, which seemed to me, given that I met some of the parents and none of them wanted to do that, they were just universally seemed to be somewhat horrified by the idea that they would uproot their lives and be looked after in Australia. Because, you know, their parents are fairly young. They're in their 40s and 50s. It seems a bit far. So I interpret that as like an ethical stance more than it might become a practical plan, but at that moment it was more like an expression of gratitude to all of the financial support that they've had from their parents. It is interesting to think about how, you know, dad's money can allow the daughter to become a feminist in this way, right? I mean, I do find that really fascinating. And some of the fathers sounded like they were feminists too, you know, supporting their daughter's independence up to a point. So that was, I mean, it's an interesting thing. And then the second question was about, can they carry it out? Again, that's a question for the next part of the study. I mean, I'm still in touch with all of the participants. I sent them all a copy of the book. So I've recently been in touch with them and I follow them on WeChat and whatever, but I haven't sort of interviewed them for a while or had really long discussions with most of them. So I'll be interested to see if my findings mirror yours, which sound fascinating. It sounds like you've kind of got a bit of an answer there, that it can be hard to keep thinking this way when you're surrounded by a society that thinks otherwise. Although I also get the impression strongly in some cases that there is a wave of discontent among middle-class urban young women in China as well, even if they haven't left. Some of them already would be suspicious of this push towards becoming sort of family-centric by a certain age. So maybe they can link up with them. We'll see. I'd love to talk to you about what you found, though. It sounds fun.
So just in closing, I want to thank Fran again for a really stunning talk, and look forward to the next stage of the research. And I encourage everyone to go and buy Dreams of Flight.